According to the CAA, the national average gas price in Canada rose to around $1.41 a litre.
Doesn't matter if it's, something for the holidays or just something every day. It seems everything's getting pretty pricey.
People are struggling in ways that are significant. They're more likely right now to be turning up in an emergency department or to be in a hospital.
Shopping experience overall to be, very shockingly expensive.
This is the reason most Canadians feel poorer today than they did 10 years ago, even though the economy kept growing and inflation is officially back to normal. The reason is simple. Food, gas, and shelter have each jumped by roughly 40% in a decade. Canadian wages never kept up, and the gap between what things cost and what people earn has been quietly widening for 20 years. That 40% number comes from a Globe and Mail analysis published in February 2026. Compared to a decade ago, food, gas, and shelter costs have each jumped by roughly 40%. That is nearly double the rise in overall prices that a 2% annual inflation rate would have delivered over that time. So if you've been told that inflation is under control, and technically it is, just the Consumer Price Index showed inflation in January easing close to the Bank of Canada's target of 2%, and Statistics Canada says for all of 2025 prices rose by just 2.1%. That is true on paper. But it's also completely out of whack with the average consumer's reality. Every time Canadians set foot in a grocery store, gas up their car, or pay their rent, the sticker shock sets in all over again. Because 2% annual inflation doesn't feel like 2% when the three things that matter most, food, fuel, and a roof over your head, have gone up by 40%. Today, we're going to walk through exactly how this happened. We're going to look at what the wage data actually shows over the last 20 years, what shelter costs are doing to household budgets right now, why 1 in 5 Canadian workers is trapped in precarious employment, what happens to families when the gap between wages and costs gets too wide, and the deeper structural problem underneath all of it that almost nobody is talking about. Let's get into it. Let's start with what that 40% actually looks like when you break it into real numbers that hit your bank account every month. Food prices in Canada are now 27% higher than they were just 5 years ago. The 2026 Canada Food Price Report from Dalhousie University forecasts that food prices will rise another 4 to 6% this year. A family of 4 is projected to spend $17,571 on food in 2026. That is an increase of up to $994 compared to last year. Nearly $1,000 more for the same groceries. Meat is expected to rise 5 to 7%. Chicken prices are climbing because everyone switched away from expensive beef, driving up demand. Restaurant prices are forecast to rise another 4 to 6% on top of what the lead researcher, Dr. Sylvain Charlebois at Dalhousie University, already calls unaffordable. He expects more restaurant closures in the year ahead. Nearly 85% of Canadians reported that their household food expenses have increased in the past 12 months. Since 2021, the overall Consumer Price Index has increased by over 18%. But the categories that actually matter to households rose far more. Shelter increased by 26%, food increased by 25%, transportation increased by nearly 20%. And those three categories alone account for the vast majority of what an average household spends every month. When the things you cannot avoid buying go up 25 or 26% in a few years, a 2% headline inflation number means nothing to your daily life. Shelter is the single biggest expense for most Canadians, and it has become the most destructive. The average home price in Ontario has reached $878,620. Average monthly rent in Ontario sits around $2,350. In Toronto, a one-bedroom in the downtown core rents for $2,300 to $2,900 a month. How a single adult in Toronto now needs approximately $75,000 to $85,000 a year just to live comfortably. A family of 4 needs $130,000 to $160,000 combined. The national average rent sits at about $2,100 a month. Vancouver remains the most expensive city in the country, with Toronto close behind. In Vancouver and Toronto, even median income earners often spend 40 to 50% of their income on rent. That is well above the 30% threshold that is widely used as the benchmark for housing affordability stress. And it means that half of what you earn before you buy a single grocery item, before you put gas in your car, before you pay a single bill, half of it is already gone to your landlord or your mortgage. Now here's where this mortgage picture gets even more painful. About 60% of all outstanding mortgages in Canada are expected to renew in 2025 or 2026. Borrowers with 5-year fixed-rate mortgages, the most common type in the country, face payment increases of 15 to 20% at renewal. Some variable rate borrowers could see their payments jump by nearly 40%. A $400,000 mortgage taken at 1.77% in 2021 cost $1,850 a month. That same mortgage renewed at 3.84% costs $2,400 a month. That's an extra $550 every single month. In Toronto, mortgage arrears have jumped 322% since 2022. The 1.8 million Canadian mortgages are renewing in the next 12 months. 1.5 million households have already renewed at a higher interest rate in 2025. So that's the cost side of the equation. Food up 27% in 5 years. Shelter up 26% since 2021. Mortgage payments jumping 15 to 40% at renewal. The 40% over a decade number isn't an abstract statistic. It's the lived reality of every household that buys food, pays rent, and fills a gas tank. Now let's look at the other side of the equation. What happened to wages while all of this was going up? Statistics Canada data show that median wages grew slower than consumer prices broadly for roughly 20 years. 20 years. That means for 2 full decades, the typical Canadian worker's pay was not keeping up with what things actually cost. Not 1 or 2 bad years. Not a temporary dip during a recession, a 20-year structural decline in real purchasing power. And here's the part that makes the averages misleading. Median wage growth has trailed average wage growth for much of the past decade. That distinction matters enormously. When economists or commentators point to average incomes rising and say Canadians are doing fine, they're including the top earners who pull that average up. The median, the actual midpoint where half of workers earn more and half earn less, tells a very different story. Top income households have seen substantially stronger income growth than those in the middle and at the bottom. The gap between the highest and lowest income households has been widening. And so when someone says average incomes have outpaced inflation, that may be technically true, but it obscures the fact that for a growing number of Canadians in the middle and at the bottom, wages have been falling behind for years. There is also a fundamental shift in the kind of work Canadians are doing, and it directly affects how much they earn and how stable that income is. Precarious employment, temporary contracts, involuntary part-time work, gig work, platform-based jobs has become a permanent feature of the Canadian labor market. It is the standard employment arrangement for roughly 1 in 5 workers, and that share is much higher among younger workers, women, immigrants, and racialized Canadians. These positions typically offer lower wages, fewer benefits, little job security, and are more vulnerable to disruption. And critically, this kind of employment weakens bargaining power. When your job is temporary and you can be replaced, you don't negotiate for a raise. You take what you're given and hope the contract gets extended. So you have 40% cost increases in the essentials over a decade on one side, and on the other side, 20 years of median wages not keeping up, a widening gap between top earners and everyone else, and 1 in 5 workers stuck in precarious jobs with no bargaining power. That is the equation that is slowly grinding the Canadian middle class down, not in one dramatic crash, just a slow, steady erosion year after year after year until one day you realize you're working harder than ever and you can afford less than you could a decade ago. When wages can't keep up with costs, something has to give. And for millions of Canadians, what gives first is food. Because rent is non-negotiable, you pay it or you're homeless. Mortgage payments are non-negotiable. You pay them or you lose your home. Gas to get to work is non-negotiable. So food becomes the flexible line in the budget, and that's exactly what the data shows. Food Banks Canada found that people with the lowest incomes now spend 66% of their disposable income on housing. In 2021, that figure was 49%. It jumped from 49 to 66 in just a few years. As the report put it, rent eats food. Housing costs devour most of the disposable income of low-income households, and whatever is left is not enough to eat properly. Food banks across Canada recorded nearly 2.2 million visits in a single month. That's double the monthly usage from 6 years ago. It took decades to reach 1 million visits in a month. It took half a decade to double that. 1/3 of food bank users are children. Nearly 712,000 visits every month from kids alone. That number has increased by over 340,000 monthly visits compared to 6 years ago. The CEO of Food Banks Canada, Kirsten Beardsley, described the surge as shocking. She said more than 1 in 4 people in Canada are now experiencing food insecurity. And the demographics of who is showing up have shifted in ways that reveal exactly how deep the wage gap has become. There has been a significant increase in 2-parent households with children accessing food banks from 18.8% in 2019 to 23% in 2025. The seniors are coming in greater numbers, single adults are coming in greater numbers, and employed people, workers with jobs, are among the fastest rising groups at food banks across the country. That last point deserves to sit with you for a moment. People who are employed, who go to work, who earn a paycheck, and still cannot afford to feed themselves or their families without a food bank. That is what it looks like when wages don't keep up with costs for 20 years. It doesn't look like a sudden economic collapse. It looks like working people quietly lining up for food. In Ontario alone, more than 1 million people made 8.7 million visits to food banks between April 2024 and March 2025. That's an 87% increase since the 2020 Hunger Report. For the 9th consecutive year, food bank usage in Ontario has grown. In the town of Cochrane, Ontario, population 5,500, the food bank served just under 4,000 residents in 2024. The town declared a food insecurity emergency after usage increased 106% in 3 years. And food bank leaders in Waterloo region reported close to 622,000 total visits in the past year, a record. The Ottawa Food Bank reported close to 600,000 visits. Multiple food banks reported that former donors are now clients. The people who used to give are now the people who need to receive. Nearly 70% of food banks in Ontario report concerns about food shortages on their own shelves. Over 50% are worried that funding shortfalls will impact their ability to stay open. While these organizations were built as temporary emergency responses, they were never meant to permanently feed millions of people in a wealthy country. But when wages fall behind costs for 20 years, and housing takes 66% of the lowest earners' income, food banks become the last line between families and hunger. And that line is starting to break. So if the costs keep climbing and the wages keep falling behind, the obvious question is, why? What is structurally wrong that's causing this gap to widen year after year? The Bank of Canada's own deputy governor put it plainly. Deep down, Canada's affordability problem is really a productivity problem. He pointed out that if Canada's productivity growth had merely kept pace with the G7 average, not let it, just kept pace, the economy would be about 9% larger today. That translates to an additional $7,000 per person, or $18,000 per household. $18,000. That's more than what a family of 4 now spends on food in an entire year. Canadian productivity growth has been trending downward for years, decades even. At around 1% of gross domestic product, Canada's private sector investment in research and development is about half the OECD average. Half. The country is spending half of what comparable economies spend on the innovation and technology that drives productivity gains. And when productivity doesn't grow, wages can't grow either, at least not in a sustainable way that keeps up with rising costs. Productivity is the engine that makes higher wages possible without just pushing prices up further. The one big reversal of this declining trend happened in the late 1990s and early 2000s, with the widespread adoption of the internet. That technology wave lifted productivity broadly and delivered real wage gains for a stretch. There are hopes that artificial intelligence could deliver a similar boost. Most estimates suggest a 0.5 to 1.5% annual productivity increase over the next decade. Even the low end of that range is, in the words of BMO chief economist Doug Porter, substantial given that Canada struggles to even get 1% productivity growth per year. But hope for a future technology boost doesn't change what's happening right now. Right now, the productivity gap means the economy is smaller than it should be. Smaller economy means less wealth to go around. Less wealth to go around means wages stay flat while costs keep climbing. And flat wages against rising costs means more people fall behind every year, not because they're making bad decisions, but because the structural math doesn't work in their favor. This is also why the 62% number matters. A mid-December Abacus poll showed that 62% of Canadians identify high cost of living as their predominant concern. And this isn't new. Polling showed 55 to 60% of Canadians were already highly concerned about rising costs in 2019 and 2015, when inflation was well below the Bank of Canada's target. The anxiety about affordability predates the pandemic. It predates the tariff disputes. It predates the interest rate hikes. Yes, it has been building quietly for a generation because the underlying problem, wages not keeping pace with the cost of essentials, has been the reality for 20 years. And when you layer on top of that a grocery market where 4 chains control 72% of the national market share, where pricing power is concentrated in a small number of companies, and where most discount banners are owned by the same parent companies, you get a system where costs are pushed up from every direction and workers have almost no leverage to push their wages up in response. The result is what the data plainly shows. A country where food, gas, and shelter are up 40% in 10 years, where median wages have trailed prices for 20 years, where 1 in 5 workers is in precarious employment, where 1 in 4 people experience food insecurity, where 2.2 million people visit food banks in a single month, where employed Canadians line up for food, where two-parent families with children are the fastest-growing group at food banks, where a single adult in Toronto needs $75,000 to $85,000 a year just to get by, where median earners in Toronto and Vancouver hand over 40 to 50% of their income to their landlord before buying a single meal. That's not a perception crisis. That's not people spending beyond their means. That's a structural failure where the cost of being alive in this country has outrun what working for a living actually pays. And it has been happening so gradually, so quietly, year by year, that most people only noticed when they looked at their bank account one day and realized they were working more and keeping less. So let's bring this back to where we started, 40%. That's how much food, gas, and shelter have increased in a decade, nearly double what a 2% inflation rate would deliver. And on the other side of the ledger, 20 years of median wages growing slower than consumer prices, a productivity level that lags the G7 average by enough to cost every household $18,000 a year in lost economic potential, 1 in 5 workers in precarious jobs, 4 grocery chains controlling 72% of the market, 66% of the lowest earners' income going straight to housing, 2.2 million food bank visits a month, 712,000 of those visits from children. These aren't disconnected problems. They're all symptoms of the same underlying condition. The cost of the essentials that every Canadian needs to survive has been pulling away from what Canadian workers actually earn. And that gap, once it opens, doesn't close on its own. It compounds. Year after year, the distance between what things cost and what people earn gets a little wider. And each year it gets harder for ordinary households to close it. Until that changes, the 40% number will keep climbing. And the people in the middle, the ones who go to work every day, pay their bills, raise their kids, and play by the rules, will keep falling further behind. Not because they did anything wrong, but because the math stopped working in their favor a long time ago. And it hasn't corrected itself since. If this video helped you understand what's happening to wages and costs in this country, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover the Canadian cost of living crisis every week here on Maple Crunch. The numbers, the data, and what it means for your household. Drop a comment below and tell us, do you feel like your wages have kept up with your costs over the last 10 years? We read every comment and we want to hear your story. We'll see you in the next one.